On January 30th, 1945, at 1940 hours, Captain Juan Pajota positioned himself behind the wooden beams of the Cabu River Bridge in Nueva Ecija, Philippines. Before him stretched an open killing ground. On the far bank, approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers were assembling for their evening formation. Behind Pajota lay 200 Filipino guerrillas, spread along the riverbank in carefully prepared firing positions. 30 minutes from now, American Rangers would strike at a prisoner of war camp 800 yards to the south. If even one Japanese soldier managed to cross this bridge, everyone would die, the Rangers, the prisoners. All of them. Pajota had spent 3 years fighting the Japanese. He understood their patterns, their weapon systems, the way they moved and thought in combat. But understanding an enemy and stopping an enemy were two very different things. The mathematics of the moment were brutal and unforgiving. 200 men against 1,000 trained soldiers supported by armor. Those numbers favored the Japanese overwhelmingly. Traditional military logic suggested his guerrillas would fracture and scatter within minutes under such firepower. The bridge would become a highway for Japanese reinforcements before the Rangers could extract even a single prisoner from the camp. Yet Pajota possessed advantages the numbers could not capture. The bridge itself was rigged with explosives, engineered into a narrow V-shaped choke point that would funnel attackers into a devastating crossfire. 25 landmines were buried in the approach, and the killing zone ahead had been prepared with meticulous care. Machine gun nests interlocked their fields of fire, creating overlapping fields of death. But the most significant advantage was the men themselves. These were guerrillas who had watched the Japanese execute their countrymen, starve them, torture them over 3 long years. These men would die before permitting those soldiers to cross. What unfolded over the next 45 minutes would rank among the most lopsided defensive battles of the entire Pacific War. Against overwhelming odds, Pajota and his guerrillas would inflict catastrophic casualties on the Japanese force. Over 400 enemy soldiers would fall. Tanks would be destroyed, flanking maneuvers would be shattered, the bridge would hold, and critically, the Rangers would complete their mission. The entire operation hinged on a decision Pajota had made just 3 days earlier, one that involved no calculations of firepower, but rather a profound understanding of how his enemy thought. The chain of events had begun with one prisoner, a man named James Baldessari, who had been among the first Americans captured at Bataan on April 9, 1942. Baldessari had served as a supply clerk with the 31st Infantry Regiment. He watched Japanese bombers obliterate his unit's equipment and supplies. He witnessed his commanders lay down their weapons and surrender. Then came the ordeal that survivors would forever remember as the Bataan Death March, 65 miles traversed across 5 to 10 days under conditions of absolute horror. There was no food. There was no water. Men who collapsed were bayoneted where they fell. Men who pleaded for water were shot. Men who shared water with friends were beaten to death. Of the 76,000 soldiers who began that march, fewer than 54,000 reached Camp O'Donnell alive. Baldessari was one of them, though survival came at a price his body would never fully recover from. When he surrendered, Baldessari weighed 170 pounds. When he reached O'Donnell, the scale showed 112. 3 months later, when guards transferred him to Cabanatuan, he weighed 94 pounds. At Cabanatuan, the Japanese fed prisoners twice daily, rice mixed with water, sometimes crawling with weevils, sometimes mixed with vegetable scraps so decomposed they were unidentifiable. It was starvation rations for men performing hard labor beneath the relentless tropical sun. The camp commander was Lieutenant Colonel Shigaji Mori, an officer who viewed surrender as the ultimate human failure. In his philosophy, men who surrendered deserved no mercy, no compassion, no humanity beyond the bare minimum needed to extract labor from their bodies. His orders to the guards were explicit and unambiguous. Work them until they die. If they cannot work, accelerate their death. By the end of 1942, 2,642 Americans had perished at Cabanatuan. Disease claimed most of them. Dysentery ravaged the camp. Malaria decimated the prisoner population. Beriberi weakened men systematically. Dengue fever struck without warning. These infections would have been manageable, even treatable, in any other place on Earth. At Cabanatuan, they meant death, because the Japanese provided no medicine and forbade prisoners from receiving any from the outside world. Baldassare witnessed the dying everywhere. Men expired in the barracks adjacent to where he slept. He watched them collapse in the latrines. He saw them fall during morning formation, their bodies simply ceasing to function. Week after week, the burial details grew larger. The work of moving the dead became ceaseless. The camp operated across 3 separate compounds during its peak years. Camp 1 held the sick and permanently disabled. Camp 2 housed prisoners deemed fit enough for labor assignments. Camp 3 served as a transient facility for those being processed or transferred. By 1944, only Camp 1 remained operational, its population dwindling through death and transfers to camps elsewhere. Despite the oppressive conditions and constant Japanese surveillance, prisoners organized covert resistance. Some constructed hidden radios from salvaged parts, carefully dismantling and concealing components during Japanese inspections. Others established smuggling networks with Filipino civilians willing to risk execution to bring medicine and food into the camp. A dedicated few maintained meticulous records of Japanese atrocities, concealing documents in latrines and buried containers, driven by the conviction that someone must survive to bear witness. The Filipino underground proved absolutely critical to survival. People like Margaret Utinsky and Naomi Flores smuggled thousands of quinine tablets into the camp, saving hundreds of lives from malaria's clutches. They carried messages between prisoners and their distant families, proving that the world outside the wire had not forgotten them. Some paid with their lives when Japanese authorities discovered their work. The labor details varied widely in scope and intensity. The 500-acre camp farm grew food almost exclusively for Japanese consumption, with prisoners receiving minimal portions from the harvest. The Cabanoan airfield detail required men to repair and expand the runway for Japanese aircraft operations. Other groups gathered firewood, hauled supplies, constructed military fortifications, and dug foxholes. Prisoners too sick to perform labor received reduced rations, a vicious cycle where illness led to starvation, which accelerated death. Starting in 1942, the Japanese began transporting prisoners to other locations for forced labor. Thousands were shipped to Japan, to Formosa, to Manchuria, to occupied territories across Asia. Many died during transport when Allied submarines or aircraft attacked the unmarked prison ships. The Japanese refused to mark these vessels, resulting in heartbreaking incidents where Allied forces unknowingly killed their own men. By mid-1943, more than half the original Cabanoan prisoners were dead. The survivors had endured the watching of friends dying from starvation and disease, suffering random violence and execution for transgressions both real and imagined. They had witnessed men shot for stealing food, beaten to death for speaking out of turn, murdered for being too weak to work. The psychological toll exceeded even the physical suffering. Some prisoners simply surrendered mentally. They stopped consuming what meager food they received. They abandoned any attempt to maintain themselves for formation. They lay in their bunks, waiting for death to come. Other prisoners observed this phenomenon and called it giving up. The camp doctors labeled it terminal despair. The Japanese commanders deemed it acceptable, even desirable. By December 1944, approximately 516 Americans remained alive at Cabanoan. Most were too frail to stand without support. Many suffered from untreated tropical ulcers, gangrene, infections that had festered and spread for months or years without medical intervention. The youngest prisoner was 20 years old. The oldest was 56. The average prisoner weighed less than 90 pounds. The worst torment was not physical. It was uncertainty and abandonment. Japanese guards told prisoners relentlessly that America had forgotten them, that their families presumed them dead, that rescue would never come. Some believed it. They composed letters no one would ever read. They crafted plans for futures they would never see. They told themselves stories about deliverance that seemed more fantastical with each passing month. Then, on December 14, 1944, something occurred that appeared to confirm their darkest fears. The Palawan massacre unfolded on that date on Palawan Island, 300 miles south of Luzon. 150 American prisoners were held in a camp similar to Cabanoan. When American forces landed on nearby Mindoro, the Japanese camp commander received orders directly from Tokyo. Execute the prisoners, leave no witnesses. Eliminate all evidence. The guards announced an air raid drill. Everyone would take shelter in covered trenches, they said. Once the prisoners were inside the trenches, guards poured gasoline into the trenches and ignited it with lit torches. Men burned alive in the darkness, screaming. Those who managed to scramble out were machine-gunned or bayoneted. Only 11 men survived. They dove into the ocean, swimming frantically toward nearby cliffs and hiding there until darkness concealed their position. Filipino guerrillas discovered them and, through extraordinary risk, smuggled them to American lines. Those survivors recounted their experience to Army intelligence officers. Within 48 hours, the massacre reached 6th Army headquarters. General Walter Kruger grasped the implications immediately. If the Japanese were executing prisoners on Palawan, they would execute prisoners everywhere. Thousands of American soldiers were imprisoned across the Philippine camps. Kruger understood he had limited time. Before the Japanese could receive and implement similar extermination orders, these men had to be rescued. Major Robert Lapam commanded Filipino guerrilla forces operating near Cabanawan. Lapam was 28, from Iowa, fluent in Tagalog, and had been operating behind Japanese lines for 3 years. His guerrillas controlled the rural areas surrounding Cabanawan. They had memorized every road, every village, every Japanese position. On January 26th, Lapam mounted his horse and rode 30 miles through Japanese territory to reach 6th Army headquarters. His horse was near collapse. Lapam had not slept in 2 days, but the information he carried would not wait. He sat down with Colonel Horton White, the 6th Army intelligence officer. Lapam unfolded his hand-drawn map across the table. His finger traced the position of Cabanawan prison camp, marked with a red circle. Approximately 500 American prisoners, Lapam reported, most of them survivors from Bataan and Corregidor. The Japanese command has issued orders to execute them if American forces approach the camp. About 200 guards garrison the compound itself. But 1,000 additional soldiers are positioned by the Kabu Creek, less than a mile north. Another 5,000 Japanese occupy Cabanawan City, 4 miles to the south. The main highway passes directly in front of the camp, Lapam continued. It is choked with Japanese traffic daily, trucks, tanks, entire military units retreating northward. All of this movement flows directly past the prisoner compound. White listened without interruption. When Lapam finished his presentation, White asked a single question. Can they be rescued? Lapam paused, considering carefully. Yes, he said, but it must happen immediately. Once American forces draw closer, the Japanese will execute the prisoners rather than allow their liberation. White immediately contacted Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, commander of the 6th Ranger Battalion. The Rangers had been training specifically for this type of operation. Small unit tactics, hit-and-run attacks, deep penetration rescues. Mucci had 121 men available. White instructed him to select his finest company and prepare for an assault 30 miles behind Japanese lines. Mucci chose E Company and F Company, combining experienced men with those eager to prove themselves. He also requested Alamo Scouts, elite reconnaissance specialists who operated deep in enemy territory gathering intelligence. 2 Alamo Scout teams were assigned, Team Nellist and Team Runceville, 14 men total representing the finest reconnaissance personnel in the entire Pacific Theater. The mission briefing occurred on January 27th. Mucci laid out the operational framework. Rangers would infiltrate through Japanese positions and link up with Filipino guerrillas. At dusk, they would assault the camp, evacuate all prisoners, and withdraw to American lines before Japanese reinforcements could converge. The entire operation had to be completed in under 12 hours. Exceed that window, and they would find themselves in daylight with 500 barely ambulatory prisoners while Japanese divisions closed from multiple directions. The risks were staggering. 30 miles behind enemy lines, no air support, minimal backup. If the operation deteriorated, extraction would be nearly impossible. The Rangers would be surrounded, outnumbered, destroyed. But the alternative was passively accepting the execution of 500 Americans. The decision was inevitable. Mucci emphasized three requirements that could not be compromised. First, complete surprise. If the Japanese detected the approach, they would execute the prisoners before the Rangers reached the camp compound. Second, precise timing. Every element, blocking forces, assault teams, prisoner evacuation, had to coordinate perfectly. Third, zero prisoners left behind. Every man comes out, or the Rangers do not leave. The Rangers prepared with intense focus. They field-stripped and cleaned weapons. They checked ammunition quantities and verified loadout procedures. They studied intelligence documents and maps until every detail was memorized. They mentally rehearsed their assigned roles repeatedly. Some wrote letters to their families acknowledging that this operation might be their last. Others prayed. A few sat in silence, processing the weight of what they were about to attempt. Captain Robert Prince would command the assault. Prince was 25 years old, from Seattle, soft-spoken and methodical. His men referred to him simply as careful. Officers who had trained alongside him called him meticulous. Mucci considered him the most tactically precise company commander in the entire battalion. Prince studied the intelligence reports with focused intensity. The camp was surrounded by open fields, deliberately cleared to prevent prisoner escapes. Guard towers occupied each corner. Wire fencing encircled the perimeter. Barracks for Japanese guards occupied the eastern side. Transient quarters for Japanese units passing through stood nearby. The buildings housing prisoners were located in the northwestern corner of the compound. The camp itself was not the primary problem. The real obstacle was the Japanese force positioned at Kabu Creek. 1,000 soldiers equipped with tanks, trucks, and heavy weapons. If they responded to the initial assault, they could reach the camp in mere minutes. The Rangers would be caught in open terrain with prisoners who could barely move. They needed a blocking force, something that could hold that river crossing long enough for the evacuation to be completed, something that could stop 1,000 Japanese soldiers from crossing a bridge. That was when Juan Pajota entered the planning. Pajota had been fighting the Japanese since January 1942. He was 31 years old, a former Philippine scout lieutenant trained at the Philippine Military Academy. When the Philippines fell to Japanese occupation, Pajota refused to surrender. He took his men into the mountains and initiated a guerrilla campaign that would span the entire war. By January 1945, Pajota commanded approximately 250 guerrillas in the Cabanawan region. They were former farmers, discharged soldiers, young students, anyone willing to fight. For 3 years they had been attacking Japanese convoys, severing supply lines, rescuing downed American pilots, and gathering intelligence. Pajota met with Mucci and Prince at Balancaya village on January 29th. He brought maps, sketches, and detailed intelligence reports compiled through months of careful observation. He understood the camp layout better than the Rangers did, understood the terrain around it thoroughly. But Pajota raised serious concerns. He asked Mucci when they planned to attack. Mucci said, tonight, January 29th. Pajota shook his head firmly. The highway in front of the camp has been congested with Japanese traffic all day, he said. Columns of trucks, tanks, entire military units moving northward. An assault tonight would be detected immediately. The first challenge was straightforward enough. They had to let the chaos of the road settle. But Pajota brought troubling news from his scouts. Those 1,000 Japanese soldiers stationed at Kabu Creek weren't sitting idle. His reconnaissance teams had spotted something concerning. More patrols moving through the area, fresh fortifications going up, defensive measures being strengthened. Something had definitely put them on edge. Mucci wanted to move immediately. Waiting felt like torture when every hour that passed might bring orders to eliminate the prisoners. The risk gnawed at everyone, yet Prince sided with Pajota on this one. They needed circumstances to shift in their favor, needed the Japanese guard to relax back into routine. A single additional day could determine whether this operation succeeded or turned into a massacre. The assault was moved to January 30th as darkness fell. This gave Pajota exactly 24 hours to accomplish what most would consider impossible. The math was brutal on the surface. How could 200 men stop an entire 1,000-strong force of trained soldiers? Most military minds would have defaulted to what they knew: bring more firepower, stockpile ammunition, gather explosives. Weapons and force seemed like the answer. But Pahota possessed something rarer than firepower. He understood how people thought and what drove them. He recognized that the Japanese had been victorious for 3 consecutive years, that they'd grown comfortable with the idea of smaller forces crumbling before them, that they'd developed a dangerous habit of expecting easy triumphs against inferior numbers. He intended to weaponize that overconfidence. His men would form a V-shaped arrangement positioned along the southern bank of Kabu River. The bridge would become the critical bottleneck. Anyone attempting to cross would be forced down a narrow corridor, caught between overlapping fields of fire from both sides. He stationed his machine gunners at the V's center point, weapons that could deliver continuous streams of bullets for extended periods without the mechanisms jamming from heat. The intention was to create an impassable wall of lead. 25 landmines got buried along the approaches. Japanese combat doctrine favored frontal assaults with wave after wave of soldiers. Those mines would shred the initial waves, leaving wreckage and obstacles that would slow whatever came next. Explosives were positioned beneath the bridge structure itself. Complete destruction would have been perfect, but demanded supplies they didn't possess. Instead, the charges would tear a gap large enough that vehicles couldn't navigate it, forcing troops to find alternate routes and lose precious time to the detour. Finally, Pahota placed himself where he could oversee everything. A commander needs to see the entire theater, needs to redirect firepower where it matters most, needs to sustain his fighter's spirit when the wounds start appearing. And they would appear. No scenario existed where 200 held against 1,000 without drawing blood. The losses were inevitable. On January 28th, the Rangers loaded into transport vehicles and departed from Guimba. They traveled to the furthest American position, and from there, everything became foot travel through hostile terrain. Darkness provided concealment as they began their trek. Filipino fighters who knew every path, every shortcut, every place the Japanese didn't patrol, guided them through difficult country and around enemy checkpoints. The preparation had been meticulous. Village leaders had ordered families to secure livestock, to keep animals quiet and unable to raise alarms. Some families temporarily relocated from areas along the route entirely. An empty house looked less conspicuous than one where people lived, but suddenly went silent at the wrong moment. Noise discipline became the religion of that movement. Rangers fastened anything that might jingle or rattle. Communication happened through gesture and hand signals only. The column moved in single file, each soldier keeping the one ahead visible in the darkness. Truck convoys filled with enemy soldiers passed nearby on the roads, and every American froze, barely breathing, hearts pounding while trucks rumbled past mere yards away, their occupants oblivious to the danger creeping through the surrounding countryside. Morning of January 30th arrived. The Rangers transitioned to daylight operations, moving now through flooded paddies, pressing themselves into irrigation channels whenever Japanese vehicles appeared on adjacent roads. Progress became agonizingly slow, each man crawling, each movement deliberate. 800 yards consumed 6 hours. The Alamo Scouts moved forward to gather final intelligence. Lieutenant Bill Nellist and Private First Class Rufo Vaquilar transformed themselves into local farmers, complete with straw hats and simple tools, walking openly toward a thatched shelter roughly 300 yards from the camp entrance. The structure gave them a perfect vantage point. They documented everything visible. Where guards stood watch, when soldiers rotated between posts, which building held the captives, where 4 tanks sat immobilized. They sketched it all before crawling back through the vegetation and rejoining the Rangers with their report. Prince immediately adjusted the strategy. F Company under 2nd Lieutenant John Murphy would strike the front, eliminating guard posts and towers. C Company under Prince's direct command would attack from behind, clearing the prisoner detention area. Exactly 1940 hours. The signal would come when a P-61 Black Widow night fighter roared overhead, creating chaos and confusion as guards turned their attention skyward. At 1800 hours, Pahota and his fighters moved into their predetermined positions at the bridge. Across the water, The 1,000-man Japanese garrison was finishing their evening assembly. Orders rang out in Japanese. Campfires flickered to life. Smoke from cooking fires drifted across the river. 1,000 men settling into what they expected would be a routine night, completely unaware that in the coming hour and a half, everything would explode into violence. Pajota checked his timepiece. 19:10 hours. 30 minutes remained. His men were prepared. Weapons loaded and ready, mines armed, explosives set. The waiting began. 19:30 hours arrived. 10 minutes now. The P-61's distinctive twin engines became audible from the south. That characteristic low rumble growing louder across the paddies. The Black Widow screamed overhead directly above the camp, engines roaring and backfiring rhythmically, banking and diving through aerobatic maneuvers, pulling every guard's gaze upward in fascination and distraction. 1940 hours. The first gunfire erupted from the camp direction. Pajota heard it clearly. The distinctive chatter of M19E-19A4 machine guns, the crackle of M1 rifles, the heavy thuds of grenades detonating. F Company had opened fire. The battle had begun. Across the river, the Japanese garrison transformed from peaceful evening to controlled chaos. Officers shouted orders. Soldiers scrambled for weapons and ammunition. Truck engines roared to life. Pajota watched them mobilizing, organizing, preparing to move toward the sounds of combat. They would rush across that bridge. They would reinforce their comrades. They would slaughter every ranger and every prisoner unless Pajota's men stopped them. The first wave of Japanese soldiers reached the bridge approach at 1942 hours. They ran without formation, just a rushing tide of bodies moving toward the gunfire. Pajota held his men back. His orders had been explicit. Wait until the enemy commits fully to the bridge. 50 Japanese soldiers stood on the bridge when Pajota gave the signal. His guerrillas opened fire as one. Machine guns and nearly 200 rifles all concentrated on that confined space. The devastation was absolute. Men toppled. Those behind tried to reverse course but found themselves shoved forward by soldiers still charging from the rear. The bridge became clogged with bodies, living and dead tangled together. 1944 hours. Pajota detonated the charges. The bridge structure erupted, a massive section blown away. Not enough to prevent soldiers from crossing if they were determined, but sufficient that no vehicle could pass. A Japanese tank rolled onto the damaged section anyway and immediately plunged into the gap, its weight and mass pulling it down into the breach. The tank became wedged, effectively sealing the crossing completely. More Japanese soldiers advanced. Pajota could see their officers attempting to establish proper attack formations, trying to organize chaos into something resembling military efficiency. The V formation caught them in relentless crossfire. Every avenue of approach was covered by overlapping machine gun fire. Rifles picked off leaders instantly. The enemy took staggering losses without gaining a single inch of ground. 1946 hours. Pajota spotted soldiers moving downstream, attempting to flank around the bridge position and cross the river elsewhere. He'd anticipated this exact move. A reserve squad positioned downriver opened fire on the flanking force. Minutes later, it was annihilated. Bodies drifted downstream in the current. They tried the bridge again. This time, a second tank accompanied the assault. Its main cannon fired toward the guerrilla positions, and one round landed near a machine gun nest, killing 2 fighters and wounding 3 others. A guerrilla with a bazooka, trained only that morning by rangers in its operation, stood up with the weapon. He'd never fired it under real combat conditions. The tank was moving, 200 yards distant, partially shrouded in smoke. He aimed, released his breath, and pulled the trigger. The round struck the tank's front armor and punched through. The vehicle stopped dead. Hatches flew open as the crew evacuated. Rifle fire cut them down before they reached shelter. The same fighter reloaded and destroyed 3 additional tanks attempting to cross. 4 tank kills credited to a man who'd learned the weapon that very morning. 1950 hours. The Japanese ceased their attacks. Pajota observed them regrouping, falling back, establishing new defensive positions on their side of the river. They'd sustained horrific casualties, lost their armor, and been repulsed repeatedly. The immediate assault had ended. But Pajota understood this was merely a pause. Japanese military doctrine demanded aggressive action. They would regroup and come again and again until either the bridge fell or they ran out of soldiers willing to die trying to cross it. 1952 hours. The third major assault came forward. This one showed greater coordination. Smoke grenades obscured their movement. They concentrated suppressive fire on the machine gun positions. Soldiers advanced in proper fire and maneuver teams, some providing covering fire while others moved forward in bounds. This was the genuinely dangerous moment. Pajota's men were taking sustained incoming fire, casualties were mounting. Machine gun positions endured constant bombardment. If one weapon fell silent, the entire defensive structure could collapse catastrophically. Yet the guerrillas held firm. They possessed something beyond tactical doctrine or military discipline driving them forward. Many had family members murdered by Japanese occupation forces. Many had spent 3 years watching their nation subjugated, their people suffering, their culture suppressed. That bridge transcended mere military objectives. It represented retribution, justice, and liberation all crystallized into one patch of contested ground they would not surrender to any force on earth. 1958 hours. A red flare rose above the prison camp. Prince's signal. The Rangers had successfully evacuated all the prisoners. Movement toward the Pampanga River extraction point was underway. The mission objective was achieved. Yet Pajota remained in position. The prisoners were still within striking distance if Japanese forces broke through. If reinforcements crossed that bridge now, the evacuation could be catastrophically intercepted. He needed perhaps 10 more minutes of resistance. 2,000 hours. Another assault came forward. This one had the desperate quality of soldiers who understood they were running out of options. They recognized the prisoners were escaping. They knew additional Japanese forces wouldn't arrive in time. This represented their final opportunity to salvage something from an increasingly disastrous situation. They charged directly into the machine gun fire. No shelter sought, no concealment attempted, simply running straight toward the guns. Dozens fell in the first volley, then dozens more. The machine guns were glowing red from sustained firing. Guerrillas poured water across the barrels, cooling them while maintaining continuous fire. Barrels steamed and hissed. 2002 hours. The assault collapsed. Surviving Japanese soldiers retreated. More than half their force attempting the crossing had fallen. Their officers were dead or seriously wounded. Their tanks were destroyed. Their fighting spirit had shattered under the weight of unrelenting casualties and complete tactical failure on that blood-soaked bridge. The red flare shot into the night sky at 20:05 hours. Prince fired it skyward, watching it burst bright against the darkness. That signal meant one thing to Pajota: time to pull back. The prisoners had made it. They were across the Pampanga River now. They were safe. Pajota gave the withdrawal order immediately. His guerrillas began moving backward through the darkness, squad by squad, covering each other's retreat with disciplined precision. They used pre-planned routes they'd memorized weeks earlier, moving quickly but carefully, staying low, watching for stragglers. Behind them, the bridge lay strewn with Japanese bodies. Pajota made a rough count as he moved. Over 400 enemy dead, scattered across the span and the approaches. His own people had paid for that victory. 21 of his guerrillas lay dead, and another 30 or so had taken wounds. They'd held off more than 1,000 attackers backed by armor, 200 men against 1,000. They'd bought that bridge for 25 minutes, and in those 25 minutes, they'd inflicted casualty rates of 15 enemy for every one of theirs. But Pajota didn't have time to dwell on the mathematics of survival. His men had to reach the rendezvous point, help evacuate the prisoners, and get everyone across the river before dawn broke. Japanese forces were already converging on the area from multiple directions. If daylight caught them here, if enemy reinforcements arrived while they were still on this side of the river, the entire rescue would unravel. Everything would be lost. The Rangers had needed exactly 30 minutes to assault the camp, pull out 516 prisoners, and reach the river. Not 35, not 25. Exactly 30 minutes, because Pajota understood something crucial. In operations like this, timing was everything. Precision mattered more than firepower. It mattered more than luck. Back at the prison camp, Prince's assault had gone almost flawlessly. The P-61 distraction had worked perfectly. Japanese guards had been staring upward at the sky, watching the aircraft, when Rangers opened fire. Seconds mattered. Within 15 seconds, every guard tower was neutralized. Every pillbox fell silent. F Company blew the main gate lock with a .45 caliber pistol and poured through into the compound. Japanese guards retreated into their barracks, trying to organize some kind of defense. They never got the chance. Rangers cleared the barracks with grenades and rifle fire. Resistance collapsed almost immediately. The camp fell into American hands. Inside the prisoner barracks, men reacted with confusion and complete disbelief. Some thought it was another Japanese trick, another cruel deception from guards who had tormented them for 3 years. Others believed they were hallucinating, their minds broken by fever and starvation, conjuring rescue from their deepest wishes. Rangers had to convince them it was real. Yes, Americans had come. Yes, they were finally going home. Some prisoners wept. Others laughed with a hysteria born from desperation. A few were too weak, too broken to react at all. Rangers found men who weighed less than 80 pounds, barely clinging to life, unable to comprehend anything happening around them. Medical personnel moved quickly through the barracks, assessing who could walk and who needed to be carried. The evacuation revealed everything. It showed exactly what 3 years of Japanese captivity had done to American soldiers. Men had tropical ulcers that ate through skin to the bone. Others had fractures that had healed incorrectly because no one had set them properly, leaving arms and legs twisted and useless. Many were blind from vitamin deficiencies that had robbed their eyes of function. Some had lost their voices entirely, their ability to speak stolen by years of isolation and abuse. A colonel, a man who had commanded thousands of soldiers before capture, now weighed 79 pounds and could barely whisper. A former athlete had legs so thin that Rangers worried they'd break if they lifted him wrong. These weren't the young, vigorous men who deployed to the Philippines in 1941. These were survivors who had endured something beyond comprehension. Then Prince faced a problem he hadn't fully anticipated. The prisoners were in worse condition than intelligence suggested. Many couldn't walk, some couldn't even stand. 3 years of starvation had ravaged their bodies, and the sudden shock of rescue was triggering medical emergencies. Several prisoners were having heart attacks from the stress and excitement. Prince made his decision immediately. His men would carry them, if necessary 2 prisoners per ranger. No one gets left behind. That was Mucci's order, and Prince would execute it regardless of difficulty. Rangers hoisted prisoners onto their backs and began moving toward the gate. Some weighed less than 90 pounds, easy to carry. Others were in such poor condition that Rangers had to fashion litters from bamboo and cloth. One prisoner suffered a heart attack as a ranger carried him through the gate. He'd survived 3.5 years of captivity, survived disease and starvation and torture, and died 100 feet from freedom. The ranger carrying him wept openly but kept moving. 515 other men still needed to get out. By 0280 hours, every living prisoner was out of the camp. Prince formed them into a column with rangers providing security on all sides. They moved as fast as the prisoners could manage, which wasn't fast enough. Japanese reinforcements were coming from Cabanatuan and other cities. If they didn't reach the Pampanga River within the hour, they'd be caught. Captain Pajota had arranged something days earlier. Local Filipino villagers had assembled a caravan of carabao carts, water buffalo-drawn wagons normally used for transporting rice and goods. There were supposed to be 26 carts. By the time the column reached the river, over 100 carts had arrived. Villagers from every nearby barangay had brought their animals, their carts, their children to help evacuate men they'd never met. Men from a country thousands of miles away. They did it because it was the right thing to do. Prisoners were loaded into carts. Those who could walk were helped across the river on foot. The evacuation became a community effort, civilians risking their lives for strangers. By midnight, the entire force was across the Pampanga. Prince sent word to 6th Army headquarters, mission successful. 516 prisoners liberated. 2 rangers killed, 4 wounded, estimated 500 to 1,000 Japanese casualties. General Walter Kruger received the message at 01 hours on January 31st. He immediately ordered a cordon of American forces forward to secure the evacuation route. By dawn, the rescued prisoners were behind American lines. 3 years of captivity were over. The 2 Rangers killed were Captain James Fisher, the battalion surgeon, mortally wounded by Japanese mortar fire on January 31st. His last words concerned the prisoners. Corporal Roy Susky was struck by friendly fire from a nervous ranger after the assault ended. 21 Filipino guerrillas died at the bridge, holding positions against impossible odds. Their sacrifice made the rescue possible. Japanese commanders couldn't understand how a small American force had penetrated 30 miles behind their lines, destroyed a camp, and evacuated hundreds of prisoners. They suspected betrayal by local Filipinos, which was accurate but unhelpful. The real concern was the bridge engagement. Over 400 Japanese dead lay on that field, multiple destroyed tanks, evidence of a well-executed defensive action. Japanese doctrine said guerrillas were inferior fighters who would break under sustained attack. This engagement proved otherwise. The implications were significant and troubling for Japanese commanders. If Filipino guerrillas could hold defensive positions against superior numbers, then no position was truly secure. Every bridge, every road, every village could become a killing zone. That uncertainty eroded confidence and forced commanders to commit more troops to rear area security, troops desperately needed at the front lines. The rescue had broader strategic impact. American forces conducted 4 more prison camp raids in the following month using similar tactics. Rangers or scouts assaulted camps. Filipino guerrillas held blocking positions. Local civilians provided evacuation support. Those raids rescued over 7,000 prisoners total. For the prisoners returning to American lines, everything changed. Medical treatment became available, real food, the slow process of recovery beginning. Many required hospitalization for months. Some never fully recovered from tropical diseases contracted in the camps, but they were alive. That was more than any of them had expected a week earlier. Medical examinations documented systematic starvation and abuse. The average rescued prisoner weighed between 70 and 90 pounds. Many suffered from beriberi, pellagra, scurvy, dysentery, and multiple parasitic infections simultaneously. Dental examinations showed teeth lost to malnutrition. X-rays revealed fractures that had never been properly set. The physical evidence supported war crimes charges. Prisoner testimonies provided detailed accounts of Japanese atrocities. They described the Bataan Death March with specifics, exact locations where men were bayoneted, names of Japanese officers who ordered executions, dates and details of specific incidents. They documented daily conditions at Cabanatuan, the starvation rations, arbitrary beatings, men worked to death, the sick left to die without medical care. These testimonies became critical evidence in war crimes prosecutions after the war. Several Japanese officers responsible for prisoner camps were tried and convicted based on survivor accounts. The rescued prisoners kept their promise to document everything, and their records ensured accountability. The rescue also allowed families to learn what happened to loved ones who died in captivity. Survivors carried messages from men who didn't survive, final words for wives and children, details about how and where men died. For families who'd received telegrams stating missing in action or presumed dead, these personal accounts provided closure that official records never could. Colonel Robert Prince received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership. All Rangers received Silver Stars or Bronze Stars. The 14 Alamo Scouts received Presidential Unit citations. General MacArthur personally presented awards on March 3, 1945, stating that no incident of the campaign in the Pacific had given him such satisfaction as the release of the prisoners at Cabanatuan. The mission was brilliantly successful. The Filipino guerrillas received Bronze Stars for their officers, but formal recognition never came for most participants. The United States classified them as irregular forces rather than official military units, creating legal complications regarding benefits and recognition. Juan Pajota continued fighting until the Philippines were fully liberated in August 1945. After the war, he applied for American citizenship as recognition for his service. The application sat in bureaucracy for over 30 years. Pajota traveled to the United States in 1976 to follow up on his application in person. He died of a heart attack on December 20th, 1976, while waiting for the paperwork to be processed. His citizenship was approved 3 days after his death. That injustice reflects a larger pattern of neglect toward Filipino veterans. It wasn't until 2003 that the United States and Philippine government established a joint commission to provide delayed recognition to surviving Filipino veterans. Juan Pajota's family received his recognition posthumously at a ceremony in Manila in 2006, attended by American veterans who had been prisoners at Cabanatuan. The raid succeeded because of combined arms operations, careful planning, Filipino intelligence networks, local civilian support, and a guerrilla commander who understood that sometimes the best tactics come from understanding your enemy's psychology rather than matching their firepower. Pajota didn't win that bridge engagement because he had superior weapons or numbers. He won because he understood that Japanese infantry would charge repeatedly, that their tactical doctrine prioritized aggression over preservation of force, and that he could exploit that predictability by creating a killing zone they would charge into repeatedly until their force was destroyed. Military academies study the raid as an example of special operations planning, emphasizing ranger training, Alamo Scout reconnaissance, and careful coordination of timing. But the most tactically innovative element was Pajota's defensive plan at the bridge, which receives insufficient attention despite being the decisive action that prevented Japanese reinforcement. Modern military forces continue studying that engagement as an example of how to maximize advantages in unfavorable situations. The principles remain applicable: use terrain to create force multipliers, understand enemy doctrine to predict their actions, position forces to create crossfire zones, maintain morale through clear communication and shared purpose. The raid demonstrates that military success requires cooperation across different units and cultures. Rangers, scouts, guerrillas, and civilians all performed essential roles. Remove any element and the operation likely fails. That interdependence deserves emphasis in an era where individual heroism is often overemphasized. The operation demonstrated the value of unconventional forces. The Philippine guerrillas weren't professional soldiers in the traditional sense. They lacked formal military training, standardized equipment, and official command structures, yet they proved more effective than conventional units because they understood local terrain, maintained intelligence networks, and operated with flexibility that rigid military organizations couldn't match. American planners learned valuable lessons about working with indigenous forces. The raid showed that local allies provided capabilities elite American units lacked: knowledge of enemy patterns, understanding of civilian populations, ability to operate undetected in occupied territory, and willingness to take extreme risks for their own liberation. Future Special Operations doctrine incorporated these lessons. The raid influenced thinking about prisoner rescue operations. Before Cabanatuan, conventional wisdom held that rescuing prisoners deep behind enemy lines was too risky to attempt during active combat. The successful rescue proved that with proper planning, intelligence, and local support, such operations were feasible. This emboldened planners to attempt similar rescues in later conflicts. The psychological impact extended beyond military circles. The American public, demoralized by years of war and worried about prisoners in Japanese hands, gained hope from the successful rescue. The story dominated newspaper headlines for weeks. Rescued prisoners became symbols of American resilience and determination. Filipino guerrillas, though less recognized publicly, demonstrated the loyalty and courage of America's Pacific allies. Lieutenant Colonel Shigeji Mori, the camp commander, was tried for war crimes at Yokohama in October and November 1947. The military commission found him guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment at hard labor. The commission imposed life rather than death because his orders had come from higher authority. Colonel Robert Prince survived the war, returned to Washington State, and died in 2008 at age 89. He never forgot Pahota's role in the raid's success and advocated throughout his life for proper recognition of Filipino contributions. Sergeant James Baldassar, the supply clerk from the 31st Infantry who had survived the death march and 3 years at Cabanatuan, returned home to a hero's welcome he didn't feel he deserved. Like many survivors, he struggled with guilt about living when so many comrades had died. He spent years writing letters to families of men who hadn't survived, providing details about their final days, ensuring they were remembered. His personal mission was making certain that the dead of Cabanatuan weren't forgotten by a nation eager to move past the war's horrors. Many rescued prisoners faced difficulty adjusting to normal life. 3 years of starvation and abuse left psychological scars that 1945 the medicine couldn't treat. Some developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Others experienced survivor's guilt, asking why they had lived when friends had died. Physical recovery took months or years. For many, psychological recovery never fully occurred. Annual reunions brought survivors together, providing community with others who understood what they'd endured. At these gatherings, former prisoners shared stories, remembered the dead, and honored the Rangers and Filipino guerrillas who'd saved their lives. As years passed and numbers dwindled, these reunions became increasingly important for preserving memory and ensuring the story was passed to younger generations. Liberated prisoners testified at war crimes trials, providing crucial evidence against Japanese officers responsible for atrocities. Their detailed accounts, corroborated by hidden documents and multiple witnesses, resulted in convictions and sentences. Some survivors found this process therapeutic, achieving a measure of justice. Others found it reopened wounds they'd tried to close. All recognized it as necessary to hold perpetrators accountable and establish the historical record. As we remember the Cabanatuan raid 8 decades later, we should remember it accurately, not as an American operation with Filipino assistance, but as a joint operation where Filipino forces played the decisive role in the most challenging engagement, not as rescue of helpless victims, but as liberation made possible by men who maintained hope through 3 years of captivity. Not as victory through superior firepower, but as success earned through superior planning, courage, and sacrifice by Americans, Filipinos, and civilians working together toward a common purpose.